Welcome back, everybody. Jen Kiaba is our next presenter. She's an artist and educator who grew up in the infamous Unification Church, a religious group referred to by popular media as the Moonies, and a primary example of a cult. After escaping a forced arranged marriage, Jen went on to earn her BA in art history. As an artist, Jen uses photography to explore the failure of faith and the resulting loss of identity that occurs. Jen's art is both moving and thought-provoking. I encourage you to visit her website through our exhibit portal. Today, she'll be talking to us about healing through art, reclaiming and rewriting your narrative. And I just want to let you know that she just received her second shot of the vaccine. So she's a little bit under the weather today. So we'll actually be watching her session that's been pre-recorded. And here we go with Jen Kiaba.
So welcome to Healing Through Art, Reclaiming and Rewriting Your Narrative. I am so thrilled that you have decided to join me today. My name is Jen Kiaba. I am an artist, an educator, and a childhood cult survivor. So what I'm going to be doing today in our talk is sharing a little bit about my background, how I used art as a healing tool, why creativity is a threat in high-demand religious groups, how religious trauma affects all of us here today, and why art is a powerful healing tool. So despite the body of growing research on religious trauma syndrome, which is what we're going to be focusing on specifically, it is a relatively new field of study. Therefore, I'm going to rely on research done on cults to help fill in some of the gaps. So please keep in mind that not all churches and religions are cults, not all cults are religions. However, some of them do exist on that sort of cultic spectrum. So if my use of the word cult feels alienating, do please feel free to substitute either the words religion or church as you see fit or as you need. So, if you've ever felt yourself tense up at the idea of creating art, I do want to reassure you that many people that I've met over the years have told me they don't feel creative, especially those of us that come from these high-demand religious backgrounds. And despite their assertions, I believe that we are all born creative, or at least with the capacity to be creative. And if we're lucky, we grow up in an environment where the adults around us encourage us to foster that creativity. However, if we grow up in a high-demand religious group or a cult, that may not be the case. In their paper, Creativity in Cults from Sociological and Communication Perspectives, the Processes Involved in the Birth of a Secret Creative Self, Miriam Williams-Borey, a PhD, and Karen Presley state that creativity is partially dependent on recognition of and acceptance by those who assign value to one's creativity. However, again, for many of us who've experienced high-demand religious groups or abusive family dynamics, our creativity was diminished or outright discouraged. And this is because creativity is not only inherently an expression of our inner selves, but it's associated with the generation of new, perhaps divergent ideas. And therefore, if our creativity and our inner self are not in alignment with glorifying the abusers who seek to control those in their congregations, groups, or families, then our creativity is seen as a threat. So, how exactly is creativity a threat? Well, in his 2015 paper, Intuition and Creativity, Shoaib El-Habib says, creativity as an individual level construct is defined by the production of novel, useful ideas, new products, services, processes, or solutions. It refers to both the process of idea generation or problem solving and the actual idea or solution. And he goes on to say that creative activity may exhibit several different dimensions, including sensitivity to problems on the part of the creative agent, originality, ingenuity, usefulness, and appropriateness in relation to the creative product, or intellectual leadership on the part of the creative agent. Do you see where I'm going with this? We're already this is going against what a lot of these high demand leaders expect. He goes on to say that others view creativity as a largely unstructured process which is grounded in the intellectual capacity to generate divergent thinking, remote associations, rich imagery, and primary processes. So the two important points that I pulled from his paper that I think are really important to underline are novel, useful ideas and divergent thinking. According to a basic definition from the dictionary, creativity means the ability to transcend traditional ideas, rules, patterns, relationships, or the like, and to create meaningful new ideas, forms, methods, interpretations, etc., or originality, progressiveness, or imagination. So, in her book Bounded Choice, True Believers and Charismatic Cults, Dr. Janja Lalich states that the cult leader, or congregation leader, if you will, define who and what is creative. However, again, you can substitute other abusive dynamics, and I still think it would be true to most people's experiences. She says, quote, "The expression of any thought, be it through song, painting, story, or other craft is generally discouraged unless that expression enhances thoughts the leaders or the power elite in a system have already expressed. So original personal thoughts, contrary to the cult's meaning system, are forbidden, and expression of such private thoughts cannot become public. For example, musicians and songwriters are encouraged to compose music for their leaders' lyrics. Writers are required to craft stories that express the worldviews of those in power, and this power dynamic in the cultic milieu supports the cult's hegemony and inhibits any questioning of the leader's naming of creativity." If we refer back to Bourrier and Presley, they say, if others, usually the leader, do not identify a cult member as creative, the member cannot continue to have a creative self without birthing a secret creative self. So, growing up in a cult, my expression of self was a threat to my parents, my faith community, and the closed society that I was raised in. I was raised in the Unification Church, and now maybe current members of the Unification Church might counter and say that creativity is actually very much encouraged. After all, in the 1970s, there were music groups like Sunburst, and today they have the band that is aptly named Sonic Cult. The church also owns the Manhattan Center off of the New Yorker Hotel in New York City, and they attempted a number of creative projects over the years. In Korea, they founded the Sunhwa Art School, originally the Little Angels School. They own the Universal Ballet, and they also have the Kirov Ballet program. And on a more local level, we had arts festivals for the second generation where we shared our music, visual arts, and films. Back in 2005, I even helped create a workshop for young actors. But again, creativity was only encouraged if it glorified Reverend Moon, the group leader, his version of God, his vision of the ideal world, etc. So in fact, our mission when engaging in the arts was to take them over from the, quote, fallen world. If our creativity didn't have that at its center, it was considered of Satan. In 2010, a respondent for the Cultic Studies Review described their experience thusly. They said, quote, "Creativity wasn't suppressed. It was co-opted, harnessed, used, channeled. From an emotional level, I want to use the word raped." Now, I kept my creative side mostly hidden and therefore didn't experience much of what the respondent did in terms of that extreme abuse of their creativity. However, I do think that their words are important to keep in mind when thinking of the kinds of creative expression allowed in high-demand religious groups and cultic environments. So again, I'm going to refer back to Bourrier and Presley. They say, quote, "A cult member might express a creative thought or show the symbolic expression of a thought manifested in song, story, drawing, etc., only to a trusted cult member or to an outsider who shows appreciation. In these cases, a creative self may have to be nurtured in secret by some cult members who do not want to expose their tangible expressions of creativity to the judgment of cult leaders. This process leads to the birth of the secret creative self." So, the creation and suppression of my secret self was an incremental process that occurred over many years. My cult identity was supposed to be kept hidden from the outside world, but the true inner self was also something that I learned to keep secret. Growing up, my mother tried to impress upon me the importance of my secret identity. She said that I was different, that I had a mission, and that I had to be very careful who knew who I was. Otherwise, Satan would attack me. It was like being born with a secret identity where I was constantly under threat by the outside world, or the satanic world, which was trying to corrupt me. Therefore, my younger siblings, myself, and all of the second generation in the Unification Church, whom we called blessed children, were brought up believing we needed to be separate from the evil outside world. In order to achieve this, many members lived together either in communal living spaces called centers or near each other in closely knit communities. And some communities even started their own schools so that their children didn't have to interact with the satanic children out there. And my siblings and I didn't grow up in one of these communities. For many of our formative years, we were about 2 hours away from the closest church community. And this meant we grew up in this strange liminal space where we were in the world, but we weren't allowed to be of it. And this meant that I had a very strong sense of otherness, both in and out of the group, and I struggled to form connections with others. I moved through the world in fear of others, initially only allowing myself to be vulnerable and create friendships in those rare sanctioned spaces that my faith and my family allowed. I strove to involve myself in every church activity I could because it was only when I was with other, quote, blessed children was I allowed to supposedly be myself. Except that I wasn't. As I grew older, the more I questioned and began to see cracks in the facade of our faith. But in the church, to question what we were taught was to invite Satan, an evil spirit world, into your mind. To fend off evil, you had to quiet the questions in your head and dive further into the teachings of Reverend Moon, whom we were taught to call True Father, by the way. And as a reflex, I felt ashamed and I hated myself for questioning, and I thought that I must certainly be evil. And I knew that my art was evil. I'd known it from a young age. Anything that the church saw in me that was not within the realm of acceptability was completely shamed out of me. And as a result, I was less comfortable showing anyone who I really was, church or no. Therefore, there were really only a few safe people with whom I could share my struggles and the art that came out of it. It was one of those safe spaces where that creative secret self flourished that Borey and Presley referred to. And at the time, I didn't have the words to describe what I felt. I hadn't learned the language of trauma or healing. All I knew was the narrowly prescribed language of the church. And yet, as you can see from one of my images from my sketchbook from high school, I clearly can describe everything that I was thinking and feeling about my world from a visual perspective. And we'll get into why that is soon. But a little bit more about my history is that at 19, I found myself on this terrifying personal precipice. I didn't know if I believed in the Unification Church's version of truth, but with no safety net outside of the church community and with a deep fear of the outside world, I didn't know where to turn. I felt trapped. Additionally, growing up in the church, I had been taught that Reverend Moon would choose my spouse. In the church, one did not date at all. Everything was separated by gender, and we referred to one another as brother and sister in order to emphasize platonic relations. So the church had a word for sex before marriage. It was called falling, and to fall was the greatest sin that could be committed. So again, at 19, I don't know if I believe in the church, but I'm also pressing up against my eligibility expiration date. Growing up, I thought I'd be married by 18 because that was the culture. And in fact, friends often asked me when I was going to, quote, join the ring club, and they'd flash their Unification Church signet rings on their right hands to me. Or they would caution me and say, if you don't hurry up, all of the good ones will be gone. And to me, that meant that because I was still on the market, I was not one of the good ones. So then news came. The aging Reverend Moon, who had directed all of the matchings, engagements, and then blessings, which were marriages, from the time that I was born until I was 15, announced shortly before Christmas that after a 4-year break, he was going to start matching the second generation again. This perhaps for the last time. So my parents were breathless with agitation. They had tried without success to find me a match and were wondering if I might be hopeless. And so my mother sat me down and she said, Jenny, if Jesus came to you and said that he had found your perfect spouse, what would you say to him? Now, how much more than Jesus is true Father? And, she asked me if I would turn the Messiah essentially down. And I didn't know how to say no, because I hadn't gotten to that point in my processing yet. So a few days later, I found myself married, or blessed in church language, to a complete stranger from another country. And that choice ended up being the final straw in the breaking of my faith. The next 2 years saw me struggling to extricate myself from that marriage. And as I struggled, the church community didn't rally to support me to save my marriage. Rather, they turned their backs on me. And then once I finally broke the blessing, which was the next most unforgivable sin, I was completely ousted. And the church taught us that to leave the faith was to open ourselves to death. Growing up, they had regaled me with stories of lightning strikes and traffic accidents where the unfaithful had met their doom. So there I was, alone, rejected from the tribe I had dared to question, and very afraid of a real death. And in the dangerous wilds of the outside world, I faced the difficult task of integrating into secular society, a world that I had been taught to shun, and to accept the fact that I was no longer a blessed child with a secret identity. So who was I, and how did I connect to the real world? After being rejected by the community of my birth, I had a genuine fear of rejection from the outside world as well. I was so afraid of being judged for what had happened to me that for a long time I just tried to pretend that I was completely normal and didn't tell anybody who I really was. No one would understand, I told myself. They would think I was weak or stupid or both. And I unfortunately did have some of those initial reactions to people early on. But over the years, as I distanced myself from the church, I shed both the language and the identity that had been foisted upon me. But I still had a lot of learning and healing to do before I had the capacity to express and understand my experience in verbal language. In the interim, I turned to art. Although I tried journaling, painting, poetry, the thing that felt the most radical to me was picking up a camera and turning the lens on myself. After all, growing up as I did, seeing myself for myself had been forbidden. In the church environment, who I was, how I felt, and what I thought, who I married, etc., was all to be interpreted by the faith. So in the beginning, I felt immense amounts of guilt when I photographed myself. The images like these always turned out looking sad and dark and depressed. And who was I to be sad? The voice in my head said. After all, I'd escaped the cult, gotten a cute apartment, had a job that paid my rent, and I'd even found a nice boyfriend. So what did I have to be sad about? At the same time, the voice in my head also accused me of being vain for photographing myself, of trying to attract the wrong kind of attention, being that stumbling block in purity culture. And sometimes the voice threatened me with retribution from the cult. And I didn't realize that this was the voice of religion in my head, still trying to keep me from experiencing myself. But despite that voice, I kept taking pictures. And for a long time, I hardly recognized myself in the images. I didn't realize that that was a leftover from the dissociation that had happened often in the cult. But I think that photographing myself was my way of trying to document my own existence for the first time. And even still, for many years as I was taking these photographs, I felt as though I was circling around my truth. I didn't know how to say, this is what happened to me. Not verbally and not in my art. In fact, I didn't even have the capacity to acknowledge that I'd been raised in a cult yet. That was something that the church taught me to believe was a false accusation levied against the church by the satanic outside world. I also didn't know that what I had grown up in was considered abuse. Then in 2012, Reverend Moon died. Even after 5 years of being out of the group at that point, his death caused something inside of me to crack open. With his death, I realized that I'd had another unacknowledged fear, that somehow Reverend Moon could still hurt me even after my escape. But now the man who had controlled so much of mine and my family's lives could no longer hurt me. For the first time since I'd left, I realized that I was beginning to feel safe, and I needed to tell my story. Initially, again, I tried writing, but still didn't know how to explain in words what I had experienced. Again, it was only with art that I felt like I could express it. And so I decided to speak in the only way that I knew how, and thus my Burdens of a White Dress series was born. It now comprises over 60 images exploring the feminine experience of growing up in a high-demand group, as well as the intersections of purity culture, coercive control, and the sexual, mental, and emotional traumas that occur as a result. Most of the images are self-portraits, and they use red, black, and white as a color scheme, and the primary symbolism with which I use to explore these issues. And for years, I struggled against shame and the internalized cult voice as I made every single image. Today, I can look back at both this project and the images that came before it and see that I wasn't just ashamed of taking photos of myself. I was ashamed of my entire story. But creating this art was a really important step in my healing. By using art, I was able to name the wound that I had no language for at the time. Eventually, I did delve into the education that would give me the framework and the language to understand my experience on an intellectual level, but I believe that many of us understand our experiences on a sensory level that supersedes language. Creating the work gave me the tools that I needed to begin writing more in depth about my story and to start speaking out about it on social media and at conferences like this. I've also returned to things like poetry, creating blackout poetry with church literature as a reclamation effort. So this is blackout poetry made from Reverend Moon's supposed memoir. And I wouldn't have been able to do any of this without first having allowed myself to explore my feelings through a more visual medium first. But perhaps the most healing thing that I've found is connection in sharing my work. The first time that I shared some of my Burdens of a White Dress series, I was so afraid I nearly blacked out in a panic. I was at this artist workshop and I slid my prints to the woman across the table from me, and she looked at them very quietly for a moment, and then she looked at me with this incredible sadness, and my heart was just hammering, waiting for her to judge me. But she said, "These photos remind me of me." And then she told me her story. And a new kind of connection was forged. Almost without fail, whenever I share my images and my story, others share their stories in return. A dialogue opens up, and I begin to hear that in seeing my work, other people find the strength to break through their fears or own their voice. And I begin to see that they also access the words that they need to use to share their story. So every single one of us here has suffered something that has become probably a defining part of our stories. And every single one of us has probably been afraid to be vulnerable and share those parts of ourselves. But when we find safe spaces to create art that expresses our stories and our truth, I believe that we can find healing and give others permission to explore their own healing as well. So I want to talk about the research behind art as a healing tool. Psychologist Marlene Winell, who is here with us, did coin the term religious trauma syndrome in 2012 in an article that she wrote for the British Association for Cognitive and Behavioral Psychotherapies. And I'm just going to give you the quick definition here. She describes it as the condition experienced by people who are struggling with leaving an authoritarian dogmatic religion and coping with the damages of indoctrination. They may be going through the shattering of a personally meaningful faith and or breaking away from a controlling community and lifestyle. RTS is the function of both chronic abuses from harmful religion and the impact of severing one's connection with one's faith. It can be compared to a combination of PTSD and complex PTSD. And I wanted to highlight her definition because she uses the phrase authoritarian dogmatic religion. So again, because RTS is still sort of a newer syndrome, I'm relying on research from cults, as I mentioned before. So I want to specifically talk about the damage that high control religions or cults can do, especially in children, because I think that many of us have experienced this kind of environment from a very young age. In her paper, born or raised in closed, high-demand groups developmental considerations, Leona Finori, a licensed social worker, references Arnold Markowitz and David Halpern's 1984 paper, Cults and Children, the Abuse of the Young, and this appeared in the Cultic Studies Journal. So she references them when she writes, a child's parent who is in a dependent regressive state due to being under the influence of the group's leaders is prone towards abusive practices, and power over children is often the only power the parents have. So most adults in closed high-demand groups live in a state of unpredictability in that one never knows when the, quote, axe will fall and the member will be disciplined. And so that can roll up to being shunned, put on the hot seat, losing privileges, etc. And she goes on to say that children who grow up in these environments are at risk for many significant issues, including, but not limited to, lack of an appropriate consistent caretaker, lack of healthy attachment to an appropriate caretaker, lack of adequate medical care, physical abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse, educational neglect, a lack of intellectual stimuli, and unrealistic expectations that children participate in adult activities such as meditation, fasting, sexual activity, and then there's also the suppression of developmental tasks. And Finori highlights that the parents of children in closed high-demand groups are often thought reformed to believe that normal human feelings for their children, such as love, concern, healthy attachment, are not, quote, spiritual, or that these feelings dilute the group's higher or special purpose. She says that children who are naturally striving to accomplish normal developmental tasks such as identity, safety, and independence are labeled possessed, crazy, or bad. So the parents' confusion, the negative labels, and the overt and covert messages that children receive about their worth and safety are all factors that contribute to the traumatic experiences for them. In his book, Therapy for Adults Molested as Children Beyond Survival, Dr. John Breer states that there are 3 primary self-capacities that develop in normal early childhood. And these are identity, which provides a consistent sense of personal existence and enables the individual to respond from an internal sense of security. Unstable identity can cause an individual to become easily overwhelmed. There's also boundary awareness, so that's the separation of self from others. Those with poor boundaries tend to allow others to intrude upon them or can intrude upon others themselves. And this can lead to also a lack of awareness of personal rights to safety and or difficulty with interpersonal relations. And then there's affect regulation. So there's 2 parts to it. There's affect modulation, which is the self-soothing technique to reduce or change painful emotions. And then there's affect tolerance, which is the ability to experience negative affect without resorting to external destructive or self-destructive behaviors like acting out. From a recovery standpoint, Finori uses Paul Martin's stages of recovery following cultic experiences, which are discussed in the chapter Post-Cult Recovery Assessment and Rehabilitation in the book Recovery from Cults, Help for Victims of Psychological and Spiritual Abuse. And she posits that Martin's stages of recovery, which I'm going to get to in a second, just have a unique twist for those who were born or raised in these high-demand groups because there's no, quote, pre-cult identity to return to in the evaluation stage, which is the first stage. So number 1 is the evaluation of the experience. And she says it's often in tandem with finding a support network, including any former members or extended family who were on the outside, education on cults/mind control, going through therapy, reading, and journaling. The second stage to recovery is reconciliation or adaptation. And she says that that is moving slowly, taking small steps, exploring a redefinition of terms, setting small goals, tending to your personal health, and discovering your own personal strengths. And the last stage is integration, which occurs over time. And I believe that art, when used to explore our experiences with religious trauma, is incredibly important for all of those stages. However, for me personally, it was most integral in the first stage. As I mentioned earlier, when I first left the Unification Church, I had no language to process my experience. I've heard similar stories from others who grew up in the church. For example, Renee is another artist who grew up in the Unification Church, and she discussed her art with my friend Eris in the Eris Meyer podcast, where he interviews ex-second generation. And she says, quote, "I filled up my sketchbooks with my turmoil. I couldn't speak my feelings because they were so outrageous. No one in the church could accept them. I couldn't use words. I would show anyone my sketchbook. I would pass my books around so people knew how I felt. It was my only way of communicating. I felt like a mute." And I think that this is likely consistent with the experience of others who grew up in traumatic circumstances. According to the Pasadena Villa Psychiatric Treatment Network, research using neuroimaging suggests that the part of the left brain associated with speech and language can actually shut down when a person tries to remember a traumatic event. So not only do many of us lack the formal language to discuss the developmental roots of our trauma, but our brains will literally shut down the areas responsible for language processing when we try to remember the trauma. And the likelihood is that for many of us who grew up in authoritarian religions and high demand groups, the trauma is not isolated to a single event, but was a pattern of abuse that was used to regulate both our thinking and our behavior. So most of us understand that arts helps us express experiences that are too difficult for words, but now we know why we struggle with the processing of language around trauma. In fact, again, according to the Pasadena Villa Psychiatric Treatment Network, traumatic memories activate the right side of the brain, which controls autonomic and emotional arousal. Therefore, they say art practices and more formal art therapies bypass the left side of the brain, and instead the art practice stimulates the traumatic memory on the right side of the brain. So as you create your art, the speech area of the brain reactivates and reintegrates with the left and the right sides of the brain. In a 2007 issue of The Arts in Psychotherapy, Francis Reynolds and Lee Hin Kim published Contributions of Visual Art Making to the Subjective Well-Being of Women Living with Cancer, a qualitative study. And they found that engaging in different types of visual arts, whether textiles, card making, collage, pottery, watercolor, acrylics, etc., helped women in 4 major ways. The first was that it helped them focus on positive life experiences, which relieved them from their ongoing preoccupation with cancer. Second, it enhanced their self-worth and identity by providing them with opportunities to demonstrate continuity, challenge, and achievement. Third, it enabled them to maintain a social identity that was resisting being defined by their cancer. And finally, it allowed them to express their feelings in a symbolic manner, especially when they were going through chemotherapy. So for those of us who have escaped closed, high-demand religious groups, the lasting effect of religious trauma can manifest in preoccupation of abuse that was inflicted on us by the group, much as the women in this study may have struggled with the preoccupation of their diagnosis. And this preoccupation in ourselves can leave us feeling stuck. Therefore, engaging in an art practice can either help us with the rehabilitation process that was discussed by Martin, or it can give us a much needed relief from that overwhelm that we can feel in our post-religious trauma life. Similarly, I believe that engaging in an art practice can also help us with our self-worth. It helps us redefine our identities outside of the confines of the religious or cult identity, and it gives us an outlet to express our feelings in the healing process. So the organization Resources to Recover states that one does not necessarily need to see a licensed art therapist in order to receive the therapeutic benefits of an art practice. In fact, they recommend activities like art journaling, sketching, making collages, sculpting with clay, etc. However, they do state that working with a licensed therapist also has its advantages because a professional can tailor each activity to your needs. So I want to talk specifically about a cult survivor explaining the benefits of art therapy. In the Cult Survivor's Handbook, 7 Paths to an Authentic Life, cult survivor Nori Muster, who's also a researcher, an artist, and author of the memoir Betrayal of the Spirit, My Life Behind the Headlines of the Hare Krishna Movement, says that art therapy gives the client a holistic medium of communication. Instead of struggling to put feelings into a linear format of word after word, clients can spill out all of their feelings simultaneously without worrying about grammar, syntax, logic, etc. And she states that art has no time element and works much more closely to the way that the brain itself works. So by engaging in a therapeutic art practice, she says that one is left with that tangible product that not only becomes the visible record of the therapy, but it can create a bridge to get to know one's inner self. And she says that this is a process called objectification. It takes one's feelings and externalizes them into, again, that drawing, collage, etc., and helps one to recognize and integrate their feelings more easily, which is what I think happened for me when I was creating art. And she suggests the following activities to get started on a therapeutic art practice of your own. The first, she says, is to make a life map. So you could use pencils, pens, pastels, paint, whatever, and draw a timeline and mark the major events or turning points in your life leading up to where you are now. She says you can make it look like a road, a clock, or just a straight line. She says another way that you can do this is with collage. So you could cut out different images that symbolize important events and add them to your timeline. Or you could use a variation on the timeline and use headlines and words to represent it. She says you can make another timeline and limit it to a single aspect of your life. My cat really wants to be a part of this presentation. Just a moment. Here we go. Okay. So that other timeline could be aspects of your life, such as your history with family, with sex, or with religion, or any other major issue that you're dealing with. She says you could do another one that's what your future would look like, or a map that freezes a moment in time. And she says that other visual art projects that you could do for therapeutic benefit are to draw a picture to show your good side and your shadow side, or your past, present, and future. You could make a pamphlet about yourself, including all the details that you want other people to know about you. Or you could make a mask that shows your inner self or some aspect that you want to integrate, and you could put it on and let it talk. Or you could draw a picture to represent a problem that you're working on or your present mood. She says that something like this you could date and start creating a journal of present mood drawings. So artist and art therapist Sarah Rosen has her clients create 3 different self-portraits on 3 different pieces of paper. The first is how you see yourself. The second is how you would like to be seen. The second is how you think others see you, and then the third is how you would like to be seen. And I have to say that when I first left the cult that I was raised in, I would have struggled to complete even the first task because I felt like I was invisible, even to myself growing up. And I think that many of us, especially those who have experienced formative years in high-demand religions, feel the same. And as we now know, according to Dr. John Breer, identity is one of the primary 3 self-capacities that develop in normal early childhood. And so trauma that we may have experienced in the group can lead to that unstable identity. But even if these activities around identity are a struggle, I just want to posit that engaging in them can be a transformative experience that can help us reclaim our stories and rewrite our narratives. Now, does your healing art have to be a self-portrait? No, absolutely not. However, I want to ask the question of what if we look at all art as a self-portrait? So American artist Richard Schmidt says, in a sense, every work you do is a self-portrait because your paintings, or whatever piece you're working on, always reveal more about you than they do your subject. Your experience of something, not the something itself, is the true underlying subject of every work you do. And if working in self-portrait feels too painful in the beginning, then I recommend working with something called a surrogate. In her class, Self-Portraiture as Medicine, artist Catherine Just encourages her students to try a surrogate as a self-portrait. She says this can be something else that stands in for you. She often encourages her students to find an object that feels representative of the self or holds meaning for them. So she often uses a white slip as a surrogate in her work. And she says, the white slip has been used in my work for years, and when it's alone in an image, it is standing in for me. This particular slip is steeped in secrets, and so am I. In the book Self-Portrait, Renaissance to Contemporary, author Anthony Bond states that through his gaze, so through the artist's gaze, the symbol of the creative power, the self-portraitist acquires a triple role. They are at once the author, the subject, and then the spectator of themselves. And I think that in and of itself is just so healing for those of us who grew up without seeing ourselves. He says that each of these three roles make a statement. The subject says, yes, I am, and I am okay as I am, which I just think is so beautiful. He says the author says, I am creating, and I am the creator. And the spectator is saying, I am looking at myself, and I can see myself. And again, I believe that all of these have an immense healing power, because the religious trauma that is inflicted onto us through cults and authoritarian groups doesn't let us do any of those things. Whether we were born in or we joined, the groups strip us of our identities and our abilities to see ourselves. But by engaging in an art practice, we are creating self-portraits of our essence, whether we are taking pictures or painting pictures of ourselves or not. Each act of creation is both a rebellion against our authoritarian pasts and a reclamation of our identities going forward. With each creation, we can rewrite both our narratives and our futures, and that is one of the most healing activities that we can engage in. So I want to end with an introduction to a movement called the I Got Out movement. And if you've been in any high control organization, religious group, etc., you can share your stories on social media with the I Got Out hashtag. You can share it on your own platform, or if you need to remain anonymous or would like help, there are resources at the igotout.org website. And when you see a survivor share their story, let them know they've been heard. I think that this is such a meaningful and healing part of the movement, because we all need to know that we're not alone. And as we all know, probably somebody who has been raised alongside of us or been in a high demand group, we can share these I Got Out posts with each other to help us in our healing. And together, we can bring awareness to how many of us have been harmed by high control organizations and end the shame and the stigma that we might feel about our experiences. So I believe that you can tell your story, you can impact lives, and you can change the world. Thank you so much.
That was amazing. There was so much fantastic information in there. I know I'm going to watch that video several times over. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Like, that in itself is so incredible. But then also your journey through art, your healing through art. You shared so much great stuff with us. Thank you. I'm really grateful that you participated.
Thank you for having me.
Wow. This was just wonderful. And I just see we have a question here. How do you internally feel comfortable to create something? I find I can barely start, often don't. Like, I just can't bring myself to create. It feels overwhelming to even try.
Yeah. I mean, you're seeing a lot of work that has taken 15 years to be able to create. I completely empathize with what you're saying, and you just take it slow. I mean, sometimes the best thing that you can do is, take your non-dominant hand, for example, and take some colored pencils or crayons and just doodle. Just start getting it out. And I think that your practice builds on itself. And I do, again, think that working with a therapist can be very helpful, because they understand how to structure some of these activities in a way that builds. But if you're not in a position to do that, then be very, very gentle with yourself and don't judge your process, don't judge your product. I think that many of us who are artists, we struggle with that. We want to create masterpieces out of the gate. And I'm definitely one of those people. And I think that, again, if you come from any kind of authoritarian background and in our hyper productive society as well, there's so much pressure. And so it's a little glib for me to say, take the pressure off, right? But I think that's the best thing that we can do. And so just pulling back the layers of the need to produce a product is probably the easiest place to start. And again, I know it's not easy.
Very reassuring the way that you put that. We do have one more question and then we have to go. Did you ever worry about or experience pushback from non-religious people who still treat religion with privileged position?
I have mostly experienced pushback from religious people. I think that most of the people who are not religious can understand various intersections of my work. There's a lot of people who understand feminine trauma. There's a lot of people who understand sexual trauma. And so it's really, again, about finding those safe spaces. I've had people, men specifically, sorry to the men here, who have said things like, ew, why would you want to create that? And it hurts. And I think that we have to build up a little bit of a thick skin, unfortunately, around that and say, well, you're not a safe person to share with, and I won't be sharing this with you in the future. So again, easier said than done. But I do think that it is important to only be vulnerable with the people that earn it.
This has just been a fascinating session. Thank you again, Jen Kiaba, for joining us. And everybody else, we're at the end of this session. You have 15 minutes to check out the exhibit hall and do whatever else you might like to do. And then join us back here for Lisa Cohn, another very interesting speaker. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.